I work with abduction victims for a living, and what the aliens do after is worse. That line sits heavy in my mouth because people imagine the worst of the sky. Bright lights, surgical tables, missing hours. Those things happen. I've seen them. But the harm that lingers, the thing that drags people into years of quiet unraveling, isn't always a scar you can point to. It's a theft of interior life, a hollowing that survivors describe in the same breath as ordinary details. The way coffee stops tasting like itself, how an armchair seems to look back at you instead of holding you, how you can be standing at a family meal and feel like a ghost at the table. I say this from a place of long work, not bravado. For nearly 2 decades, I've met people who returned from their encounters intact on the outside and nonetheless reported waking into a world that no longer recognized them. They were sent home to their houses, their partners, their jobs, and yet something essential had been pulled out of the room with them. Confidentiality binds the stories I carry, but patterns repeat. The faces change. The ache is the same. If these stories matter to you, subscribe and stay with me. There are more accounts like this and resources in the description for people who need help listening at the right volume. The first case I want to tell you is a composite. An older man I'll call Thomas, stitched together from several clients so that his life can stand for many lives without exposing anyone. He was ordinary in the way that small losses make you ordinary. Retired from a trade he loved, a neat yard he tended with the same slow mechanical devotion for 30 years. A photo of a woman in a faded frame on the mantel. He lived alone now after his wife died 5 years earlier, but his days had shape. Coffee at 7, the paper on the porch, the armchair by the window for his afternoon reading. His hands still smelled faintly of oil from his trade. He wore sweaters that were slightly too warm for spring, as if heft could substitute for company. The night of his reported encounter, he told me, began as any other. He had been awake in that armchair, light from the television humming against the ceiling, the house leaning into the quiet. A small, rising loneliness, the kind you can name but not catch, made him stand, make himself another cup of coffee. The kettle clicked off, steam swirled into the kitchen light. He said, almost as if he were ashamed, that he found himself asking the question out loud into the room. Why do we die? That question matters because it is ordinary, and also naked. It's the kind of small confession you make to the air at 2 in the morning when morning presses like a physical thing. For Thomas, the question didn't echo and die. Something answered. Not with words exactly, but with an impression that lodged behind his ribs. A presence that felt to him like an attention so precise it was surgical. It wasn't a voice he could replay in a recording. It was a pressure, a knowing, then an absence. He woke on the floor in the morning with a kettle half an hour cold, a smear of coffee on his shirt, and a day that had eaten itself around a blank. What followed is the kind of slowly accumulating erosion I watch again and again. When Thomas tried to tell the story, he fumbled for punctuation and then for meaning. He would pause not because memory failed him in the way of forgetting a name, but because a whole stripe of his biography was blank when he reached for it. He might stand at his wife's photo and feel nothing, not anger, not relief, nothing. He called it the quiet that wasn't mine. Friends said he seemed distracted. His daughter thought he'd grown tired. He thought he was going mad. This is where the worst sits. Not in the immediate terror of whatever transpired, but in the slow internal shrinkage that followed. Survivors like Thomas speak of pieces of themselves being missing, not metaphorically, but as if a seam had been cut and stitched wrong. They report a dulling of emotions, grief that had been a live chord now reduced to an abstract fact, joy turning brittle, laughter that didn't reach the eyes, a perennial sensation of being behind a pane of glass while the rest of the world continued with its colors. They talk about memory as a house with rooms removed. They wake up from naps and cannot locate an hour, a week, an entire month, as if someone had taken keys and left the hallway intact, but the bedroom's empty. The language people use matters. They take, survivors say. They leave holes. They put something in its place that makes it harder to go back. In my practice, I hold those words as testimony, not proof of ontology. Whether the taking is literal in the sense of a machine extracting a filament, or whether it is a needle of suggestion that rewires attention, The effect is the same for the person living it. A theft of agency, of continuity, of the architecture of self. Thomas's story deepened in edges when I began to ask not just about the night, but about what the years after felt like. He had trouble naming seasons. People reported time itself behaving like a ragged thread. A day might stretch so long it seemed like a year. A year might collapse and leave a silence between milestones. Some say that time becomes a stack of photographs with the captions removed. You can see the faces, but the stories that made the faces make sense have been taken away. There are other recurrent phenomena I must name because they appear across narratives. Memory gaps, as I've said. Emotional flattening. Dissociation, where the person describes watching themselves act from outside their body, like a passenger on a fixed, sterile carriage. Intrusive presences, not always malevolent in a cinematic way, but persistent, an internal narrator that judges, instructs, or saps spontaneity. Changes in sensory taste, coffee, music, smell, that suddenly feel wrong or hollow, and a sense many describe best as alienation from the very anchors that kept their life oriented. Old friendships that no longer pull them, rituals that feel meaningless, the skeletal familiarity of home that no longer supports them. I remember the first time a client told me, quietly and almost apologetically, that their taste for coffee had been replaced by a memory of drinking something else during the event, a synthetic sweetness that had no name. I took the detail in and did not make a show of it. It sounded odd, but so did 1,000 other things in people's lives when you unpick them. Later, in another interview, a woman described her laughter as if someone had sipped it and left the glass empty. Still another said he could not feel the sting of loss over a friend's funeral. The grief had been attenuated as if someone had clipped the wires and left the light dim. None of this is a tidy medical category. I do not use it that way. But as a clinician and field worker, I have to find models that hold the experience enough to allow intervention. Over years of listening, patterns emerge. The most useful metaphor I borrow from the survivors themselves. Extraction. They describe an interface, not always physical, often described as a kind of attention or focusing, where something attends to an inner piece of life and then removes or alters it. Afterward, what remains can feel like a well-kept room with a hole in the floorboard. The surface looks the same, the routines still run, but the depth is missing. This theft of personhood is what makes the aftermath worse. Imagine grief as an instrument. When it plays, you know you are alive. It tells you where your attachments are and how wide your love runs. Remove the grief and the instrument remains silent. You are not healed. You are muted. Without the capacity to grieve, to rage, to delight fully, relationships wobble. The people around survivors think nothing catastrophic has happened because the body keeps functioning. The job is kept. The lawn is mowed. But the person inside is reduced to a functional shell. They navigate days without the compass of interior feeling, and the moral stakes of that are enormous. Thomas came to me because his daughter felt the gap more sharply than he did. She spoke of how her father no longer recognized the cadence of forgiveness in their arguments. He could apologize by rote, but it was somehow flat. He would go out to pull weeds and come back speaking of a color he could not place. He tried to press his hand to his chest and say that he was still there, but the words slid off like something not meant to be grasped. In the first sessions I do with people like Thomas, I am listening for anchors. These are not dramatic. They are often small threads. A particular song he hummed with his wife, the smell of a certain soap, the exact way his wife's left hand would grip his. I ask about objects, gestures, routines. We map these anchors gently, because often the loss is not total. Sometimes it is an attenuated echo, a faint vibration where a chord used to be. Recovery work begins with those faint vibrations. Before the scaffolding of therapy began for Thomas, there were signs that he had been modified in subtler ways. He reported a persistent internal commentary, a low, insistent voice that suggested choices to him, recommended actions that felt not like his own promptings but like a looped recording. "You don't need to call her," it would say. "Don't be heavy. Move along." Other times the voice offered observations that felt diagnostic, as if the outside attention was cataloging, making notes. Memory hole at coordinates X, emotional range dampened. Whether this voice was the survivor's own defense mechanism, an implanted script, or the residue of an encounter, it functioned to disorient. People are robbed not only of things but of the ability to trust their own inner weather. I want to be clear here. I'm not saying these inner voices are evidence of aliens in a cosmic sense. I'm asserting what survivors say and what patterns I observe in clinical contexts. We are ethically obliged to translate experience without converting testimony into metaphysical fact. That caution matters because our work is to restore agency, not to anchor people to new dogmas. One of the most difficult effects to watch is how survivors start to doubt themselves in ways that make them vulnerable to suggestion. If your continuous sense of yourself is punctured, you become more likely to accept an external narrative about what you are, what happened, and who you should be. Some survivors adopt new belief systems that give them framework and meaning, which can be helpful in the short term. Others become riskily credulous, picking up explanations that fit because their own sense of truth has been stripped of weight. The ethical work we do is to give people a safe place to test their reality without coercion. Thomas's mornings became a slow reconciling with things he had once loved. He would sit in the armchair, and instead of feeling the quiet communion he'd had with a book, he felt like a man half aware of the page. He tried to recreate rituals, lighting the same cigarette his wife had smoked, reading the same column, brewing the same coffee. The rituals carried him in some mechanical sense, but not into the interior that gave them meaning. He described this as living with an empty center, a phrase that has become common in the testimony I collect. A particularly striking moment came when he tried to remember the exact timbre of his wife's voice when she first called him Tom. He could recall the occasion, the porch, the fabric of the dress, the slant of the sun, but not the sound. The remembering reached for the voice and came back with a blank. He told me that the loss felt like someone had gone into his house at night, opened a drawer, and taken something he didn't even know he treasured until it was gone. When I asked him how he managed days, his answer was thin but honest. He would map his movement like a pilot follows instruments, check email, water plants, call his daughter weekly, go to the store on Tuesdays. He spoke of small victories, savoring a particular brand of popcorn, catching himself at the right moment to laugh genuinely at a TV joke, sensing the first warmth of sunlight on his face in a way that was not merely physical. These micro-moments remind us of the plasticity of the human interior, that it can be coaxed back to life in tiny increments. But with micro-victories come relapses. After an evening where he felt a tiny bloom of warmth at a neighbor's joke, Thomas would wake the next morning with the same old mute center. He could not predict the swings. That unpredictability wears people down. It turns simple choices into heavy labor. Deciding whether to go to a family dinner becomes a question of whether you can risk exposing the strippedness inside you. Many survivors withdraw. Isolation becomes a default protection against the disorienting experience of being seen and not recognized by the people who love them. Across cases, another subtle but corrosive pattern appears: the rearrangement of personal values. Things that once mattered become small. Things that were peripheral gain odd salience. A man who used to fix cars now spends hours cataloging the arrangement of pebbles on his driveway. A woman who loved painting abandons the easel and becomes obsessively concerned with locking doors. These shifts are not simply eccentricities. They are survival strategies of a rewired inner ecology searching for footholds. Professional colleagues have had different ways of explaining these shifts: dissociation, post-traumatic adjustment, a defensive reconfiguration. I use none of those as neat labels but watch for their signs because they guide intervention. For survivors themselves, the explanation is less important than the lived experience. They ask, how do I feel again? How do I make the coffee taste like coffee? How can I be present enough to love and be loved? There is a moral urgency to these questions, not because we must prove an external cause, but because every day that interior life remains shrunk is a day the person loses silent, irreplaceable parts of themselves. Relationships fray. Work performance may decline. The simple pleasure of a walk becomes difficult because the path that once held memory and meaning no longer leads anywhere. Before I met Thomas, he had been to other practitioners: a doctor who ordered tests, a therapist who offered talk therapy that failed to touch the numbness, a pastor who prayed and then set him to scripture. None of these were bad responses. They were different tools in a surgeon's tray. What had been missing was sustained, framed attention to the interior void as a real wound, and a space to reclaim the small anchors that reorient memory and feeling. When Thomas first sat across from me, what struck me more than his story was the tone he used to tell it. Flat, as if the words themselves had been thinned by time. He watched me closely, as if measuring whether my face was a place where truth could be risked. That looking is everything. If the practitioner is not a witness who can hold the strange without contempt, the survivor withdraws. If the witness is cold or sensational, the survivor will either ornament the story or collapse from shame. The ethics of listening shape the outcome before any method begins. So we started small. We made a map of objects and acts that once held meaning to him. We collected songs that were important, textures, scents, photographs. I asked him about his wife's hands again, and coaxed him to hum a tune that had always made her smile. He was reluctant at first, embarrassed by the thinness of the sound his throat made. But something shifted when he kept at it. After a long minute of humming, he said, in a voice that was not flat for the first time, "I think I can almost hear it." Nearly every story I tell in sessions has that moment of a micro-return. It is not dramatic. It is not a miracle. It is small and stubborn. The coffee tastes of the first small victory when it happens. The smile returns in a photograph. Someone notices. Somebody else is able to hold the story instead of making it into a spectacle. Yet the work of repair always encounters a wall. The thing taken is not simply a lost memory, but a reorganized interior. Sometimes the person reports new scripts or commands that block access to feeling. Sometimes there is outright resistance. People tell me they feel pushed away when they move toward a lost memory, as if an internal veto is guarding the absence. That guarding can be adaptive in the short term. It keeps someone from falling into an abyss of unbearable grief, and pernicious in the long term. It prevents reconnection. Negotiating this tension is a central part of the work. A week into our sessions, Thomas returned with a small, tremulous report. He had gone to the kitchen to make coffee, and paused, hand on the kettle, and thought of an old joke he and his wife used to share. He laughed aloud, a sound that startled him with its brightness. He wrote the joke down on a scrap of paper. Later he called his daughter, and for the first time in months, told a story that included the color of a dress her mother had worn the night they met. She cried on the phone and said, "Dad, I haven't heard you say that in years." He told me that the phone conversation felt like a bridge he had not known was still standing. These small landmarks are not endpoints. They are ways of testing whether the inner world returns when we coax it. They are the early, fragile evidence that the architecture of self can regrow scaffolds, and that the missing rooms are not forever sealed. And yet there are nights I lie awake thinking about the people who never find the sound of a returning laugh. For every Thomas who takes a tentative step toward a remembered taste, there are others who remain caught in a loop of muted responses, whose anchors do not re-engage. It is not a failure of will. It is the consequence of something that has altered the way memory and affect are bound together. We cannot promise full reclamation. We can only offer steady, dignified methods of attention and repair. There is another strand to this story that complicates the moral landscape. Survivors do not always describe the post-contact phenomena as wholly negative in a simple binary. Many say that something else came back with them too. A clarity, an urgent curiosity, new interests that rearranged their life. Some find purpose in the aftermath. But even when there is a new edge of meaning, it can coexist with a sorrow for what was removed, and that grief is valid. We must hold both truths. People can gain new faculties while also mourning what was lost. At the end of our early sessions with Thomas, as the sun slanted through the blinds and dust motes spun like slow satellites, he said something that stayed with me. "It's like I can remember being a man who felt things for other people. But when I try to touch that man, he doesn't feel like mine." He reached for a word and found none that fit, so he invented one. Apartness. It was the best descriptor he could muster, a noun that held in its mouth the ache of being divorced from oneself. We made a plan to build toward retrieving the missing threads, not by forcing memory but by inviting it. We would do so cautiously, with containment and with an eye toward the tiny indicators that someone was safe to go deeper. But before we could begin the slow, methodical work of reintegration, something in the archive of Thomas's experience demanded to be acknowledged, a pattern that suggested the aftermath was not random, but systematic. That pattern is what I want to describe next, because it reframes the problem from the level of individual loss to a collective set of features survivors report. It is also the reason many of us in the field have learned similar first moves when we meet clients. We look for anchors, we stabilize the somatic, and we track the rhythms of return and retreat. But describing the pattern requires us to attend to the language people use when they say, "they took things," not as proof, but as a consistent report that points to a common phenomenology. In my experience, survivors often report three overlapping after-effects that frame their suffering: holes in narrative continuity, dampened affective range, and the presence of an internalized external attention. I will explore each of these in detail and share how they show up across different lives. But first, before we move into the mapping and some tentative explanations we offer in clinical practice, I want to leave you here with Thomas, at his kitchen table, a scrap of paper with a joke in his hand, a laugh still nascent in his chest. The moment is fragile and instructive. It tells us that reclamation is possible in increments, but it is not inevitable or easy. Soon I will outline the patterns we see across survivors and begin to talk about how we work, methods that prioritize safety, grounding, and the slow retrieval of agency. For now, hold the image of Thomas laughing, of that small bridge between the man who left his wife in memory and the man who is learning to return. It is a beginning, and in many cases, beginnings are the only place to start. In my experience, survivors often report three overlapping after-effects that frame their suffering: holes in narrative continuity, dampened affective range, and the presence of an internalized external attention. I want to take each of those and follow them down into the lived texture of people's days, because understanding the shapes of the harm helps us know where to place our hands when we attempt repair. Holes in narrative continuity look like sudden blanks in a life story. Not the forgetting of a shopping list or a name, but a removed chapter. People reach for an event and come up with a thumbnail, the table, the light, the furniture, and the emotional wiring that made the moment matter is gone. One woman I worked with, a teacher named Lila in the composite sense, could describe with precise clarity the day she and her partner had adopted a dog, the shelter card, the rain, the brittle laugh they shared. Yet when asked about the feeling she had in that moment, the surge of being needed, the sense that the future had rearranged itself around the animal, she said, "It's like there's a room I used to enter and now the door is nailed shut. I can see the wallpaper but I can't get in." For her, the photograph of the dog did not carry its original charge. It was a neat, color photograph and nothing more. Those blanks matter because memory is not only content, it is connective tissue. When a birthday, a funeral, an argument, or a simple picnic loses its emotional knot, subsequent events struggle to link. You show up to a family meal, and you are missing the part of you that remembers why certain stories make someone laugh, why your father winces at a joke, why your sister avoids a phrase. The household rhythm becomes slightly off-key. People notice, spouses feel rebuffed, children feel misunderstood, friends begin to stop offering the stories that used to be shared. The survivor's internal landscape has lost some compass bearings. Dampened affective range, the second thread, is frequently described as a quieting, a flattening, a blunting. Survivors tell me that their emotional dial has been turned down. Joy is there but thin. Grief is present as an outline, but not as a wound that throbs. Anger, which once served as an alarm, either surges in disconnected episodes or fails to light when it ought to. One composite client, a former paramedic, said it was the strangest and most frightening thing to stand at a bedside and not feel the rush of alarm and compassion that had always been automatic. He reported acting with competence, but later realizing he had been going through motions, like an effective actor performing the role of someone who cared. The moral economy of relationships depends upon effect. Love is not merely a proposition, it is also an enacted, felt reality. When someone's affect is blunted, their partners and friends feel the absence as a personal slight, even if that wasn't the intent. The survivor may sense a gap between action and inner reality. They can say, "I love you," and mean a version of it habitually, but the word lacks the timbral warmth that makes the declaration believable. This disconnect breeds shame in the survivor and hurt in the people who try to be close. The third thread, the presence of an internalized external attention, is perhaps the strangest, but the most frequently reported. Survivors often speak of an other inside, not always like a voice from outside, not always a literal dictation, but an attention that catalogs, judges, or suggests. It may sound like a quiet, editorializing thought that always knows where your memory gaps are and points them out. It may be more intrusive, a felt insistence that certain feelings are dangerous, that some memories must not be touched. One client described it as a librarian with a torch moving through my archive, keeping things behind glass. Another called it the presence, and said it often feels more curious than malevolent, like an examiner rather than a tormentor. The form varies, but the effect is similar, a second order of surveillance that corrodes trust in one's inner compass. Taken together, these three effects form a particular phenomenological pattern. The world remains intact, the body functions, life is navigable in a utilitarian way, but the person inside experiences a narrowing. That narrowing is what survivors call worse. It's not measurable like a broken limb. It's the loss of access to the textures that made life meaningful. Given that pattern, how do you intervene? What follows is not a recipe guaranteeing recovery. It is a description of an approach we've refined over years of work, combining somatic practices, narrative reweaving, and communal reattachment. I offer it as an informed outline, methods we use, practices survivors often find helpful, and the cautions that shape how we proceed. The first move is validation and containment. This sounds simple, but it is often the hardest step in practice because it requires the practitioner to hold paradox without collapsing into skepticism or credulity. Survivors need to know they will be listened to without being turned into a spectacle. They need someone to name the strangest things alongside them. You felt a presence that judged you. You woke with an hour gone from your day. You remember the furniture but not the feeling. Naming is not explanation. It is the beginning of containment. Containment means creating a bounded time and space where experiences can be narrated and where emotional dysregulation is anticipated and held. I build that containment in the first sessions by co-creating a safety plan. What to do if memories become overwhelming. Who to call if dissociation begins. How to anchor oneself physically at moments of distress. It is mundane work, logistical, and often life-saving. Parallel to containment is somatic stabilization. Many survivors report bodily sensations of disconnection, a sense of floating off, a drop in the center of weight, a clenching in the throat. Somatic stabilization is about returning attention to the body in small, manageable ways, so the nervous system learns there is a safe ground to come back to. We use simple practices because simplicity is accessible and repeatable. One micro-exercise that we teach, and that I will guide you through in a moment, is a grounding anchor based on sensation and naming. It is not medical treatment, but a tool people can practice between sessions to cultivate steadiness. These practices are offered with the caveat that if someone is experiencing severe dissociation or distress, they should consult a qualified therapist or medical professional for tailored care. Alongside grounding, we begin narrative mapping. This is not the coercive excavation of an investigator. Rather, it's a collaborative cartography. We lay out life events like a map on a table and mark where the gaps are, where colors have faded, and where anchors remain. Anchors are the small sensory threads, a song, a texture, a smell, a habitual gesture, that still hum faintly when tugged. In mapping, we pay attention to sequences. Which memory tends to cue which feeling, which ritual still triggers a quickened heart. The map helps us find entry points for restoration. An anchor that reliably evokes a piece of feeling becomes a hinge by which more can be retrieved. Memory retrieval in this context is paced and invitational. We do not coax memories out with pressure. Survivors report that sometimes the internalized attention will guard certain rooms fiercely, and attempts to force access can produce shutdown. So retrieval is typically structured as a series of invitations. Would you like to try to visit the porch where you remember the meeting? Paired always with an exit strategy. If at any moment it becomes too intense, we will stop and resettle. We use imagery, sensory prompts, and sometimes gentle guided recall to help a person re-inhabit a scene. When a piece comes back, a scent, a phrase, the cadence of a voice, we treat it reverently, allowing it to be recorded, written, or otherwise honored, so it does not become ephemeral. Somatic practices often accompany recall. The body remembers before the mind can narrate. Movement, breath, touch, and posture can unlock affect. I work with somatic practitioners and movement therapists who help survivors reconnect to their felt sense. A release in the diaphragm that lets a suppressed laugh surface. A hand-on-knee exercise that anchors a person in the present enough to report an associated memory. For example, with one client named Maya, a composite, we paired memory prompts about a particular cafe with a sensory exercise. She held a warm mug and focused on its weight, temperature, and smell while describing the day the cafe first felt like hers. The warmth in her palm helped tether the memory to the present. The recall of the cafe's light and the barista's laugh allowed her to access a taste of joy she'd thought lost. She later described that moment as the taste coming back. And that phrase lingered in our work as a marker of progress rather than proof of completion. Ritualized reclamation is an important next step. Ordinary rituals can become sites of repair. Making the same coffee but with intention, naming the recipe aloud, setting a place at the table, placing a photograph in view, turns habit into rehearsal. We encourage survivors to create small rituals that act like repeated exposures, gradually redescribing a relationship to the lost parts. Ritual is not magical. It is a practice of rehearsal that slowly redescribes neural pathways through repeated attention. One client wrote a short letter to a missing aspect of herself once a week and burned it in a small dish. The act of articulation and release helped anchor grief and create a sense of agency. Reintegration work asks survivors to test reclaimed fragments in the messy theater of ordinary life. We plan exposures carefully, a short, contained family visit rather than an entire holiday dinner, a 5-minute phone call instead of a long catch-up, a 10-minute painting session instead of days at the easel. These small tests are monitored and debriefed. What came back? What collapsed? What felt like a foreign script? The work of reintegration is iterative. Small successes are recorded and celebrated because dignity returns in accumulations. Community repair is the final piece. Healing often stalls when survivors are isolated. Trusted friends, family, or support groups who can witness without sensationalizing are vital. We coach loved ones on listening practices, ask open questions, avoid leading or pressuring for details, resist the urge to fix with platitudes. A friend might say, "Tell me one small thing that felt different today," instead of, "Are you getting better?" That small nuance makes room for survivors to report micro-victories without the weight of expectation. In our practice, we sometimes run family sessions where a member learns to mirror back a survivor's report in neutral language. "You said the laugh came back last week. That must have felt surprising." Simple mirroring builds trust because it communicates attentiveness rather than astonishment. It's important to emphasize that these interventions do not presume to prove or disprove the ontological grounds of the experience. We are, pragmatically, restoring function and meaning. Whether the gaps are the result of an external agency, a neurobiological response to extreme stress, or a complex mixture of both is a question that belongs to research, not to the immediate ethics of care. Our obligation is to the person who sits before us. With that ethical frame in place, I should name some of the tentative mechanisms we hypothesize, not to assert their ultimate truth, but to make sense of observable phenomena and to explain why certain practices appear to help. One working metaphor survivors often use is extraction. In clinical language, extraction does not require belief in a literal surgical removal. It can be described as a process where attention, whether external or internal, targets a memory or affect and sequesters it. Sequestration is a term clinicians sometimes borrow to describe how painful material becomes walled off. The effect is similar whether the wall is built by the mind to protect or imposed by an external attentional event. The person loses access. When somebody says they took it, they may be trying to name that sequestering. Our interventions aim to reduce the boundaries of that sequestration gently and safely. Another metaphor is dampening circuitry. Imagine the emotional system as a set of amplifiers and filters. Survivors often experience certain amplifiers turned down or certain filters stuck in place. Practices that recalibrate, whether somatic exercises that unclip tension in the chest or guided narratives that reattach effect to memory, functionally restore some of that circuitry. A third dynamic we observe is script insertion. Survivors sometimes report new, repetitive scripts, internal narratives or rules that direct behavior. Don't call her, don't feel too heavy. That feel like overlays on top of their prior self. These scripts can be adaptive during an acute period. They may protect against unbearable feeling. But when they persist, they limit spontaneity and agency. Our work is often to make those scripts visible, examine their origin and function, and then offer alternative scripts that are chosen rather than imposed. This is not an imposition of another ideology. It's co-creating new patterns of thought and action that restore choice. None of these metaphors is a literal truth. They are tools to guide care. They help survivors and clinicians reason together about what to do next. We remain humble about causation while being rigorous about the relational and therapeutic work. I promised a micro-grounding exercise earlier, because people in the audience may be living with sudden waves of dissociation or the odd alarming sense that an hour has gone missing. This is a short, sensory practice I often teach in early sessions. It is simple and repeatable. Treat it as a stabilizing pause rather than a cure. Find a chair, sit with both feet on the floor and let your hands rest on your thighs. Look around and name quietly to yourself 5 things you can see, 4 things you can touch, 3 things you can hear, 2 things you can smell, 1 steady breath. As you move through each number, pause briefly and notice the sensation tied to the naming. If a memory surfaces, let it be observed, but do not chase it. If your mind slips into judging the experience, bring attention back to the count. Repeat this sequence 2 to 3 times, and then take 1 deeper breath, feeling for the weight of your body on the chair and the contact of your feet on the floor. It sounds trivial, but people report that calling the senses back into the present can loosen the grip of a panicked or bewildering moment. Again, this is a coping tool, not a substitute for professional care. In the clinic, we layer such micro-practices with longer processes. A typical series of work might proceed in stages over months, building safety and containment, stabilizing with regular somatic practices, mapping anchors and beginning low-pressure retrieval, ritualized rehearsal of reclaimed pieces, incremental public exposures and family work, then periodic reassessment. Progress is rarely linear. People can take 2 steps forward and 1 back. The role of the clinician is to keep the frame steady and to honor the pace the person chooses. I want to share a fuller vignette of someone who made measurable, though not total, movement through this process. This composite, whom I'll call Elena, was in her 30s and worked in community health outreach. She had a partner, 2 cats, and a small garden. After her reported encounter, she described waking with a smooth absence where her sorrow used to be. She could list facts about her relationship, but said she felt disconnected from the affection that had once driven her to acts of care. Our work with Elena began with containment, creating a safety plan for moments of dissociation and identifying 2 anchors, the smell of her partner's cologne and the ritual of stirring sugar into her morning tea. We practiced a modified grounding routine in sessions. Elena held a small river stone, described it in 4 sensory words, and then placed it on the kitchen table as a reminder. We used the stone as an object anchor during brief memory rehearsals about their first camping trip. On the 2nd week of work, while gently journaling about that trip, a sensory detail returned: the taste of canned peaches they had eaten by the lake. It was small, but Elena described it as a taste inside me I hadn't tasted in months. The taste did not unlock everything, but it lit a filament of feeling that allowed her to tell a story with a tone that had some warmth. We paired that retrieval with behavioral experiments. Elena and her partner agreed to create a 5-minute ritual each evening, making tea together and sharing one small moment from the day. That ritual was not pressure to feel but a rehearsal, repeated, predictable, low stakes. Over months, she reported incremental changes, a genuine smile at a joke, a pang of grief when a TV character died, a sudden memory of a tender touch. None of it was complete. She still had blank rooms. But the accumulation of small returns reshaped her daily life. She reclaimed enough of an interior compass to feel more anchored in her work and in her relationship. Another important element was community support. Elena joined a small peer group, not a sensationalist forum, but a moderated circle where survivors could share micro-wins and setbacks without being subjected to others' certainty claims. The group served as a place to practice language again. Being able to hear someone else say, "I had a day where the laugh came back," normalized the possibility of change without promising it. I tell Elena's story not to suggest all survivors will follow the same arc. Many do not. For some, the repair work is lifelong. For others, progress stalls or shifts unpredictably. The point is that even small recoveries matter because they restore the possibility of choice. This brings me to an ethical territory that we must not skirt. How to support someone who reports these experiences when you are not a clinician. If a friend or loved one tells you that something came into their life after a strange event, and they feel muted or alienated from themselves, there are a few simple practices that help. First, listen without therapy. You do not need to offer explanations or diagnoses. A listening posture is to mirror, to reflect, to ask gentle curiosity questions. What did that feel like for you? Or, what helped you get through today? Avoid immediate verdicts like, "It's all in your head," or, "Maybe you're making this up." Those responses close doors. Instead, open them. Second, ask what help they would like and make an offer that does not require a heavy commitment. "Would you like me to sit with you while you try that grounding exercise?" Or, "May I help you find resources?" Third, maintain boundaries for yourself. Hearing about such experiences can be unsettling. It is appropriate and wise to seek counsel from professionals if you are unsure how to help. If you are a clinician encountering these reports, humility and rigor must go together. Screen for danger, dissociation, suicidal ideation, severe functional impairment, and when present, consult with qualified medical or mental health professionals. At the same time, create a practice culture that neither pathologizes the survivor's language nor reifies extraordinary claims into unquestioned facts. Our ethics require that we meet testimony as testimony and treat symptoms as symptoms. Keep records, provide referrals to somatic practitioners when appropriate. Coordinate with family clinicians only with explicit consent. Confidentiality and consent are non-negotiables. There are also field-level cautions. We must resist narratives that turn survivors into evidence for broad conspiracies. Why? Because such narratives too often strip the survivor of nuance and make the event into a headline rather than a human story. Survivors deserve context that prioritize their healing over an agenda. If someone chooses to adopt a conspiratorial frame because it helps them feel grounded, that is their agency. Our role is to ensure that choice is informed and not coerced by a community that demands a single explanation, which brings us to resources. In the description linked to this video, you'll find a primer we compiled, a short downloadable guide with grounding exercises, questions to ask a trusted practitioner, and a list of vetted somatic and trauma-informed clinicians who work with non-ordinary experience. There is also an option to schedule a private consult with our practice for those who want individualized attention. I want to be explicit. If you decide to reach out, ask about the practitioner's approach to containment, somatic work, and narrative mapping. Ask whether they collaborate with medical professionals and whether they practice with consent and confidentiality at the forefront. There are two more realities I want to hold before we close. The first is that some survivors will never reclaim the exact interior they had before. New arrangements can form, new loves can arise, different kinds of meaning can be grown from altered soil. We must allow space for that grief alongside the hope of restoration. Mourning the irretrievable is as legitimate a path as celebrating the returns. The second reality is that some survivors will find explanation and reclamation through frameworks I do not offer here. Spiritual practices, artistic transformation, community activism. Those paths can be healing. My ethic is to support an individual's informed choice while ensuring they are not coerced into a single narrative. Back with Thomas now, because his story still holds a lesson about the pace and the raggedness of repair. Months into our work, he began to keep a small notebook where he wrote one memory each day. At first the entries were blank, single lines like, "Clouds today." But slowly, they grew color. She laughed at the dog last week. The lavender smelled like the place by the river. One evening, his daughter texted a photograph of the house where they had once lived together. In the photo, her mother sat on the stoop holding a mug. Thomas looked at it and felt a warmth move through him that he could not immediately name. He did not call it joy. It was closer to recognition, a soft tightening in the chest that told him some wiring might still be intact. He brought the photograph to our session and said simply, "I remember the way her hands warmed the mug." That sentence, short, slight, was a milestone. It did not mean full recovery. It meant a string had been retied. There were setbacks. There were days when the journal pages remained stubbornly pale. There were times when Thomas felt embarrassed to accept small returns, as if gratitude would announce that everything else was irretrievable. We worked through that shame together, naming it, welcoming it when it appeared, and putting it down without fanfare. I remember the time he came back from the garden holding a small clump of clover and laughing because a neighbor had told a poorly timed joke. The laugh startled him, and he wrote in his notebook, "Laughed like me." He read that line aloud in session, and we both heard how thin and true it was. If there is a single practice that seems to hold across cases, it is patience coupled with attention to micro-events. Recovery, if it happens, is built of small returns that accrete into resumed interior life. The aim is not perfection. The aim is to restore enough felt continuity that one can choose again and again how to respond to the world. Before I close, I want to speak directly to anyone watching who recognizes themselves in these descriptions. If you find that your inner life has been altered after an anomalous experience, know three things. First, your report deserves to be heard without ridicule. Second, help exists in many forms: somatic practices, trauma-informed clinicians, peer groups, and asking for it is a courageous step. Third, progress is often incremental and not guaranteed, but small reclamations are real and meaningful. If you are supporting someone, offer steady presence rather than solutions. If you are a clinician, maintain rigor and compassion in equal measure. My work brings me into contact with a variety of explanations. Some survivors choose metaphysical frameworks, others prefer psychological models, some hold both. I do not insist upon any single interpretation because my ethical obligation is to the person, not to an ideology. Whether what happened is caused by an outside intelligence, a neurobiological reaction, or some combination, the harm that follows is real to the person who lives it. We are obligated to respond with methods that restore agency, dignity, and connection. And so we return to a quiet image to close. Thomas, in his yard. He moves more slowly now, with the careful deliberation of someone exercising a muscle that has atrophied. The grass is trimmed. The light at dusk is long and forgiving. He sets a small chair near the azaleas and tends them with the slow, attentive hands of someone practicing presence. A neighbor walks by and says hello. Thomas looks up and returns the greeting with a small but genuine smile. It is not a triumphant scene. It is not a healed ending. It is a person practicing being present, day by day. And that practice alone is a statement of resistance against the quiet theft he once described. If these stories matter to you, if you want more case studies and practical resources, there is a primer linked in the description that you can download. If you or someone you know needs individualized help, the same description includes a link to schedule a private consult with our practice. We do this work with humility and discretion, and we welcome inquiries from people seeking a careful witness. They come back breathing, but sometimes something else leaves the room. The worst part is not always what happens up there. It is the slow, internal narrowing that follows the return. But the story does not end with what is taken. Even small returns, the taste of coffee restored for a morning, a laugh that surprises, a remembered timbre of a loved one's voice, are pieces that can be gathered back. What they take can be reclaimed.